What's up, everyone? This is Noa Dalzell, and I'm here with another episode of You Got Boston. Recording this late on Monday night, early Tuesday morning, after the Celtics beat the Jazz without three key players: no Jason Tatum, no Al Horford, no Kristaps Porzingis. No problem for the Celtics, who win five in a row. Have now won 12 of their last 14, I believe, and have just been kind of the team that we expected them to be, the team that they were last year, and not the teams that they were in December and January when a lot of people were concerned about their play and concerned about their kind of fall through the standings and just kind of inconsistent basketball. So today's episode, we'll touch on a couple things. Wanted to touch on because Kristaps Porzingis and his illness, because obviously he has missed 7 of the last 8 games. Everybody's a little bit worried about him, and he provided an update at the half. Like, he literally tweeted out an update, so we can chat about that. And then also just wanted to kind of talk a little bit about what Jaylen Brown said post game. Post game, he was asked by a reporter that's not on our beat. Actually, I'm not sure who it was, or I would credit them, but somebody not on our beat came asked kind of how would you compare this year's team to last year's team, and Jaylen said that he actually thinks this year's team is better. And I thought that was really interesting because obviously I think the discourse this season has been that this team is not as good as last year's team. Their record is not quite as good, and not by much. They've won 72% of their games last year. They finished at a 78% win record. But the main difference is that they're not the number one seed. Last year they had about a 10-game lead for most of the post All-Star break season in the standings for the number one seed. So there was never a question around like, do they need to win more games? It was a question of like, do these games even matter? And now they're pretty much out of the hunt for the number one seed because Cleveland's been so consistent. And so I think very few people would say, oh, yeah, they are better this year because their record isn't as good. They went through a stretch that was they didn't go through last year, and they have the third best record in the league, whereas last year they were by far the most dominant team during the regular season. But here's what Jaylen Brown said. I'm going to read this quote because I do think that this quote was kind of insightful. He said, "We had to make adjustments throughout the year. I feel like that has made us better, and we're poised. We're more experienced. We've been there before. I think our trust is there. So we just have to have that mindset each and every night to come out and dominate, which is hard. But I think we're a better team than we were last year." And I love this quote because one, he explains why he says that. He recognizes the fact that maybe they haven't had that mindset that they have to go out and dominate every single night. But even still, they've had to adjust to the fact that teams are guarding them differently this year. Teams have made an effort to run them off the three-point line, especially in the last few months, because they recognize how much of their success comes from being a three-point heavy offense, and just threes are worth more than twos, right? So there's that piece of it as well. And then the reality is they've also had to deal with the fact that different guys have struggled. Jaylen did not have a great first half of the year from an efficiency standpoint. Drew dealt with a bunch of different things. He hasn't been as efficient as he was last year. Kristaps Porzingis in and out of the lineup. Different guys dealing with different things. Sam with a lower back injury. Just, I think they faced more adversity this season than they did last year. Last year was kind of like the picture perfect season where everybody played well. A lot of guys had career years, not really any substantial injuries. And so, and in a way, they hadn't actually been there before. A lot of people wonder, like, is this team going to falter in the postseason like they do every year? That was kind of the discourse at that point because they had never won the championship. I think this year they have the confidence and poise to understand that they have been there before. They know what it takes, and they've been challenged more this year. They've had to adjust their schemes. They were guarded differently. I think you saw that when Kristaps Porzingis came back in the lineup, that all of a sudden this team had to figure out how to win because he was guarded differently, that the team was met differently, a lot more physicality. I think it's not a secret that teams try to be physical with the Celtics and think that that's going to maybe rattle them. And there were low moments. I mean, I go back to that loss versus Toronto on the road where it was like guys after the game were just down. There were moments where they were a 500 team for weeks. And I think when you go back to those games and you go back to those stretches, this team is probably better because of that. I think the fact that Derrick White had a massive slump, he's talked openly about the fact that he lost his joy, that he really hadn't faced that type of adversity during his Celtics tenure. Like, those are good things that happen. You want to have those character building moments. And I don't overlook Cleveland. I don't overlook Oklahoma City because I do think those are both really great teams that are not fraudulent teams. Their record reflects their elite play. The record reflects their depth, the high caliber play of their star players, but they actually haven't dealt with like really severe adversity this season. And I'll mention Oklahoma City. They lost Chet for a lot of the year. They lost Isaiah Hartenstein for a lot of the year. So they've had to play without star players. And I do think that's character building. And I do think that will help them ultimately, because you just never know when in a title run. You can't assume that everybody's going to be available the entire time, because as we've seen, they're usually not. Cleveland's had phenomenal help this season to their core players. Obviously, guys have dealt with various things, but largely speaking, you look at last year's Cleveland team to this year's team, like Cleveland's had a much more healthier season. And so, knock on wood, I hope that they're able to maintain that health. But neither of those teams went through like a losing stretch. And sometimes that's fine. Celtics last year had a kind of perfect regular season. Obviously they had a couple losses here and there, but they didn't really deal with severe losses. And sometimes that can come back and bite you, that you didn't have to push through that. And because Cleveland and Oklahoma City both haven't made deep playoff runs before, neither team has made the conference finals. You wonder, like, if they do go down 0-2 in a series, like, what are they made of? And I'm not saying that I think that they're not going to be able to respond, but I get what Jaylen's saying about his own team, that the adversity, the struggles, the adjustments, the experience, like, it actually makes them better this year than last year. Right now, their record is a couple games back of where they were last year this time. I think like that's going to be the first thing that people notice when they think about this team, and that's valid. And I think that the reality is that her record should be better than it was. It is right now because they lost some very winnable games during that 6-week span where they were kind of playing like a 500 team. Right now they're 47-18. They're 7.5 games back of the number 1 seed, which is Cleveland. At the same time, they're 6 games ahead of New York. So in that same sense, I think down the stretch here, right, games are not going to matter as far as the standings go, which I think can be boring for some people if you realize like the games don't actually matter. But at the same time, they provide the opportunity to see really meaningful basketball in another way. And that's what I'll talk about in a little. But just to wrap up the initial thought here about Jaylen Brown saying that this year's team is better than last year's team, I think you might be right. That's my take. I wouldn't have thought that a few months ago. I would have thought like, they clearly have missed a step. At the same time, like, championship, teams, you go back and you look at their record the following year, they're almost always worse the following year, almost always. And so even if they're going to repeat, and so it was kind of inevitable that they were going to be a few games back. They're only a few games back of where they were last year. The biggest difference is that there's 2 teams that are having historical regular seasons that weren't in the picture last year. There weren't teams that were having those kinds of seasons last season. And that's the big difference. That's the big story. And ultimately, if something changes this year and they lose, I actually don't think it'll be because they were worse this year than last year. It'll be because they ran into a threat that they didn't run into last year. And just being around this team, I called them rattled a few times. I do think that individual guys on this team were. I think Derrick White, he's talked openly about the fact that he lost his joy. He lost his confidence. And I do think that there were moments in time where he looked a little rattled out there. And that's a guy that has kind of an unshakable confidence in a lot of ways, or so it seemed. So it was weird to watch. At the same time, I think a lot of other guys that struggled between Jaylen Brown and Jrue Holiday, both of whom have had less efficient seasons than they did last year, especially the first half of the year. I don't think those guys got rattled. I think those guys are veteran players. And this is not a shot at Derrick at all, because I think Derrick is the coachest guy out there. But you could tell that emotionally he was kind of experiencing this kind of struggle for the first time. But Jaylen Brown, Jrue Holiday, like, I do think that the struggles that they went through this year might actually prepare them for the playoffs. And Jaylen's numbers have been on the up of late. He's been better in the second half of the season. He's a guy who steps up in big moments in big games. And you saw that versus Cleveland. Yes, 37, massive game versus the Lakers, 31 points, great defense on Luka. So I think his body of work speaks for himself at this point. Eastern Conference Finals MVP, Finals MVP. I understand where his confidence comes from. And ultimately, I do think that he's going to be able to step up when it matters. And I don't think his shooting struggles are going to mount through the playoffs. And the last thing I'll say, Jason Tatum's a better player than he was last year at this point. He is. He's a better playmaker. We've seen him be more consistent. We've seen him kind of dominate the game in kind of more subtle ways. His assist numbers are up, his rebounding numbers. But besides for just scoring, like, you could just tell his decision-making and his reads are more crisp than they were last year. He also went through a massive shooting slump in the playoffs last year that I would expect he doesn't go through this year, just because there's no reason to think it's going to happen again. So that's another place, another margin of error that they have. Kristaps Porzingis missed the entire playoff round, basically, except for a couple of games in the finals and the couple of first games of the first round. And so That's another thing where, again, he's ill right now. I'll just mention briefly, he tweeted out at halftime that they're working to identify what this viral illness is. On a personal level, that's scary. Obviously, from a health standpoint, you hope he's okay. You hope that it's nothing serious. You hope that they can get a handle on it. At this point in early March, I don't have any reason to think that it's going to extend through the playoffs. Like, I would be forget basketball. I really hope and pray that that's not the case. He's missed about 2 weeks of basketball, which obviously is a longer time than you would expect for the flu or things like that. But it's not unheard of in the NBA. There's been some nasty viruses going around. Hopefully, this is one that's just lingering. But again, another guy that I expect to be available in the playoff run that wasn't last year. So as you know, I'm kind of, as I'm talking this through, I feel more and more confident that this team is going to be able to actually repeat, and this team's actually poised to repeat. And again, a lot of things could go wrong. But I get Jaylen Brown, when he said it at the post game, he said, I think this team's better than last year's team. I sat there and I was like, that's a weird, I wouldn't have thought that. And the more I've been kind of thinking through it, the more I see what he's getting at. And I think that he actually might be right. And Tatum's growth is a big part of it. I haven't even mentioned the fact that Payton Pritchard was, a regular bench player last year, and he's going to be sixth man of the year this year. It's almost inevitable, and has just showcased that he's able to handle an offensive load that I don't know if people believed it was capable of. I believed in it because I thought that he was going to be eventually an all-star caliber player, and I still think that. But I know a lot of people wouldn't have guessed that he was going to have a 43-point night because, Tatum was sitting, or multiple 30-point games, 20-point outbursts in big moments. A lot of games earlier in the year where he kind of bailed them out, where they came out flat. So that's another piece of this, is that Payton Pritchard's a guy that I think you can count on in the postseason, whereas last year he was more of a wild card. And there's still going to be questions around whether he's going to be targeted defensively, his size, the fact that he hasn't had to carry a big load in the playoffs historically. But I feel pretty confident in the fact that he's going to be able to kind of carry through this playoff, this regular season success into the playoffs. And I do believe that that's the case. I do think that there's a good reason to think that, a lot of these guys are going to be able to advance and kind of move forward and carry on their success from the regular season and from last year's playoff run. PrizePicks is the best place to get real money sports action. With over 10 million members and billions of dollars in awarded winnings, PrizePicks has made daily fantasy sports accessible to all. You just pick more or less on at least 2 players for a shot to win up to 1,000 times your cash. Run your game all season long on PrizePicks. PrizePicks is the best way to get action on sports in more than 30 states, including California, Texas, Georgia, and Florida. PrizePicks is the best place to get real money sports action. Join over 10 million users and sign up today. Sign up today and get $50 instantly when you play $5. You don't even need to win to receive the $50 bonus. It's guaranteed. PrizePicks also offers weekly promotions that can lead to big payouts like Taco Tuesday. Each Tuesday, PrizePicks discounts select players' projections up to 25% to provide even more value for your lineups. This week on PrizePicks, I'm looking at the basketball board and I'm selecting Jason Tatum for more than 29 points and Anthony Edwards for more than 25 points. Download the app today and use code CLNS to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Download the app today and use code CLNS to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. PrizePicks, run your game. So that's kind of what I'll say about the comparing this year's team to last year's team. The other thing I wanted to mention is just this homestand's been really fun. I've been on the road a lot this year. There've been a lot of big moments, a lot of big games. But in the past week, we saw 4 Celtics players set new career highs. Baylor Scheierman had a massive game, 15 points. That was his career high. That was really his first time getting substantial minutes. And that was versus 76ers, I believe. Let me actually confirm that, because I thought I had these all at the top of my head, but I'm actually blanking on Baylor Scheierman's. And we had obviously the 2 games that I don't think anybody's going to forget. And that was versus the Blazers, where Payton Pritchard and Derrick White became the first Celtics in NBA history, or in Celtics history, to each score 40 points per game. Payton Pritchard finishes with 43. Derrick White finishes with 41. Just an awesome, awesome game. It was so fun to watch. The crowd was going crazy. You realized you were watching history being made, and there was just like a fun vibe for it being 2 guys that I think have just sacrificed a lot, that have done a lot for this team. And that it probably could have much bigger offensive loads elsewhere. So that was versus the Blazers. The next night, was the 76ers, where Baylor went 15 points, 5 of 10 shooting, 3 of 7 from the field, 3 rebounds, 3 assists. Like, it was his first real complete stat line. Played 30 minutes in that one. And then tonight we see Sam Hauser, who set a career high of 33 points. Honestly, I thought his career high would be higher, but when you think about it, he doesn't really get a lot of shots. Joe Mazzulla said after the game, he doesn't get a lot of shots in the playbook, so it's really about finding him when he's open. And so he gets his career high. And the career high guys would got water bottles splat, kind of thrown at them. So going into the locker room, the Celtics posted on social media, but they kind of got drenched. So it's been fun to watch individual guys kind of have these top tier performances. Other guys have been in and out. Drew Peterson had his moments. He got to start a couple days ago. Jordan Walsh had a couple games where he played double-digit minutes, and then a couple of games where he didn't play at all. He was a DNP versus the Jazz. The two-way players, Miles Norris, the newest guy, J.D. Davison, who was G League MVP in February, and then Drew Peterson. They spent the first part of this homestand with the Celtics, and they are back with Maine now. And so that's been fun. That's been cool to watch. Just them get the opportunity, and Maine has been awesome. Maine has been a very dominant team, rising up through the standings. At one point, they had won 10 of 11, and so those guys have been a big part of that. But it's just the reality is in the playoffs, most guys are not going to play. It's going to be an 8-7 man rotation. If everybody's healthy, that means that really the only guys off the bench that I think will play will be Luke Cornett, Sam Hauser, and Payton Pritchard. And even those guys, like, it might not be a Luke Cornett game, and all of a sudden he's going to be very limited. Might not be a Payton Pritchard game. I don't think that'll happen very often, but you never know. Sam Hauser, if he's struggling, like, you never know. So there's a lot of moving pieces there, but I do think that those guys are probably going to be kind of the critical mass of the playoff rotation. Obviously, Al Horford, I didn't even mention him because I almost view him as a sixth starter at this point. He really has started what feels like the majority of games over the last 2 years. I don't actually have that stat in front of me. But yeah, I think these moments are important. One, for morale, for guys like Baylor Scheierman, who's not going to play in the playoffs, but is on the team. Like, to have known that he got his feet wet, he got that real NBA experience. It's good for Sam Hauser to have a 33-point night because it's good for his confidence. And then you might need him in the conference finals, and he gets 3 shots a night. Like, it's not that because he had a big game in March, all of a sudden he's going to make them, but it's rhythm ultimately, and it is big for him to have those moments. Jordan Walsh, rookie, not rookie anymore, but was a rookie last year, really didn't get much of an opportunity. This year, I think that if you had to use him in the playoffs for a limited stretch, you would get more confidence in him because he has played more extended stints. So I love these kinds of games. I know for a lot of fans, like March basketball, when the seedings are kind of already ironed out and there's not like an MVP race or anything super interesting in the background for the Celtics, everybody just wants it to kind of be mid-April. But I think these moments are really important. I think the fact that you have guys making career highs, you have different guys stepping up in different ways. Neemias Queta has had some big games, during this stretch. Luke Cornett's just been awesome. The only guy that really hasn't seen much is Xavier Tillman. And again, he's not on the injury report, but I do think that he has been dealing with some knee stuff. Like, there were a couple of games where he was listed on and off. He hasn't really played a lot in garbage time even. So I don't know. That's just speculation. I'm really not sure if that's true. I mean, we'll see. If he gets any more opportunities, but Xavier Tillman's not a guy that really has gotten much run at all, considering he's not a two-way. But yeah, I think in general, like, this has been a fun little stretch here, and there have been some premier games. Cleveland, they should have won that one. They had a 20-point lead, they blew it. Lakers, 20-point lead, they held on. Nuggets, they got that one. So they had 4 contenders really during this stretch. I would classify the Cavs, the Nuggets, the Lakers, and then the Thunder, who come on Wednesday, as all contenders. So it was a difficult homestand. It is a difficult homestand. There's one more game. And then the schedule kind of loosens up. They go to Miami, they go to New York, 2 road games that are against, lower tier opponents. Miami, obviously not quite the same juice of a matchup as it once was. And then they have later a 6-game road trip that starts off with games against the Jazz again, the Blazers, the Kings, and then they have 3 games. I'll be joining the second half of that road trip. Memphis. Can I remember where I'm going to be? Yeah, Memphis, Phoenix, and San Antonio, which won't have Wemby, so that's a bummer. Phoenix, not as good as we thought they were going to be. No Marcus Smart, so when I booked this trip, it was a little bit more exciting. But still, it would be great to be on the ground and covering this team kind of through the home stretch here. But yeah, that's kind of where the season's headed at this point. And I think they're going to be the number 2 team. It looks pretty solid that the Knicks will be number 3. It looks pretty solid. Let me actually confirm before I click record or click publish on this. But I think the Pistons are still kind of holding on to that number 6 seed. Let me confirm that though. Okay, NBA.com has updated their standings to the flow chart here. Yeah, the Pistons currently have a 5-game lead over the Hawks. At this point in the season, 5 games to me, it's like I'm going to just count on it. Obviously, anything can happen, but I'm going to assume that they're the 5 seed. So right now, as it stands, the Celtics are going to play whoever comes out of the play-in, and there's 4 teams in the play-in. There's the Hawks and the Magic. They're the 7-8. The Heat Bulls are 8, 9, and 10. Say that holds. I pick Miami out of Chicago. Miami's going to play, let's say, the Magic. they have one of those teams they're going to face in the first round of the playoffs. None of those teams are super formidable. Different teams pose different challenges. Miami, I think, historically has been the scary one out of the play-in. I don't really feel that scared of them right now, just considering they don't have Jimmy Butler. I don't think they have enough juice without him. The Hawks, I think that's a team that's very limited, very flawed defensively. But Trae Young's a big game player, so he could steal a game or two just off of his massive performances. And then Orlando, just where they're just on a free fall. They had such a good start to the year, despite injuries, and I think the injuries just kind of have become too much. No Jalen Suggs, he would have been a problem. So nobody in that play-in really scares me from a Celtics perspective. You move on from there. I mean, again, you don't want to overlook anybody, but you move on from there. Next round, you got New York. New York is a team the Celtics have kind of owned this year, all 3 games. Right now, they have a 6-game lead in the standings. New York's really just struggled against the best teams in the league. The other thing I'll say is Jalen Brunson just sprained his ankle. He'll be out for at least a couple weeks, so hopefully he'll be back in time for the playoffs, but you never know. So that's just another dynamic at play. So I don't want to overlook the first 2 rounds, but I think the first 2 rounds are not going to be too difficult. And again, maybe New York will be upset by Detroit. You never know. I don't want to take any of this for granted, but it's all possible. And then Cleveland will face Milwaukee in the second round, which is actually probably a tougher matchup than New York in my eyes, even though the Knicks have had a little bit of a better record. And again, they could all change, but that'll be a tough series. I still think Cleveland will come. So I think we're headed, all this is to say, and not to go too boring through the standings, all this is to say I think we're headed towards a Celtics Cavs conference finals that feels pretty inevitable right now. That's the only thing I'm willing to call inevitable. The Cavs have won 14 games in a row. This is not their first double-digit win streak. They've just been so awesome this year. They've been so consistent. I don't think they're getting upset. I don't think the Celtics are getting upset after being this kind of consistent veteran group. So I think we're going to see the series. I think it's going to be a great series, and the winner of that series is going to head to the finals and face one of the several good teams in the finals there right now. Oklahoma City has an 11-game lead, very Celtics-esque from last year. Out of respect for that lead, you got to pick them as number 1. And then 2 through 5 in the West, very close. You got the Nuggets, the Lakers, the Grizzlies, and the Rockets, all being separated by 2 games. So outside of that, tough to say exactly where things are headed. But fun little stretch here. Jaylen Brown says this team's better than last year's team. I think he might be right. We'll have more coverage coming up this week. More post-game coverage after Wednesday's game from Oklahoma City. You can check that out on CLNS Media, and you can check all the press conferences on CLNS Media as well.